I woke up to the smell of disinfectant and the sound of a monitor counting out my breaths like it was afraid I might forget how. For a second, I thought I was dead. My body felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. Then I heard his voice. "She fell down the stairs," my husband said, impatient, rehearsed. "She's always clumsy." That word, clumsy, landed harder than the pain in my ribs. I kept my eyes closed, not because I was asleep, but because I was scared that if I opened them, he'd see the truth in my face, the truth he had been training me to hide for years. My name is Zola, and the man standing beside my hospital bed was supposed to be the person who loved me most. Instead, he was the reason I was there. I could feel hands moving over me, gentle but precise. A woman's voice asked questions I didn't answer. A man's voice followed, calm, measured. Doctor voices, professional voices, voices that had heard lies before. My husband talked too much. He always did when he was nervous. He joked about accidents. He complained about the wait. He checked his phone. He never once asked if I was in pain. When the doctor pressed lightly against my side, I gasped before I could stop myself. The sound escaped me, raw and sharp. The room went quiet. "That's not consistent with a fall," the doctor said softly. I felt something shift then, not in my body, but in the air. The lie my husband carried into that hospital started to crack under the weight of years. I didn't know their names yet. I didn't know they were already making decisions. All I knew was that for the first time in a very long time, someone was looking at me and not believing him. People love betrayal stories about cheating and secret affairs, about emotional revenge and lies exposed. They think betrayal always starts with romance and ends with dramatic confrontations. But sometimes betrayal is quieter. Sometimes it wears a wedding ring. Sometimes it tells the same lie so many times that it almost sounds like love. That night, while my husband sat outside tapping his foot and checking the clock, a group of strangers began doing something he never expected. They began saving my life. Before anyone asks why I stayed, I need you to understand who I was before I became the woman in that hospital bed. When I met Kofi, he was charming in a way that made you feel chosen. He remembered small things, the way I liked my coffee, the scar on my knee from when I was 10. He made me feel seen. That is how trust begins, not with fear, but with attention. We lived in Georgia, suburban streets, neat lawns, neighbors who waved and never asked questions. From the outside, we looked like a solid marriage. People said we were quiet, private, drama-free. They didn't know that silence can be engineered. The first time he hurt me, he apologized for hours. He cried. He said stress made him snap. He said it would never happen again. That moment becomes the blueprint. Betrayal doesn't arrive fully formed. It tests boundaries, then returns stronger when it learns you will forgive. Over time, the apologies got shorter, the explanations got colder. I learned which topics to avoid. I learned how to read his moods. I learned how to hide bruises, how to laugh at dinner parties, how to tell myself this wasn't who he really was. That's the deepest form of emotional manipulation, convincing you that the person hurting you is a temporary version, while the real one is just around the corner. The night I passed out, there was no dramatic argument, no shouting, just a look in his eyes that told me I had gone too far by asking a simple question. When I came to, we were in the car. He was calm, too calm, already planning the story. At the hospital, Dr. Amani Jones introduced herself. Her voice was steady, but her eyes lingered on my chart longer than necessary. Nurse Eli Cole adjusted my blanket, careful not to touch my side. When they asked me how I fell, I repeated the lie. I had practiced it. But bodies tell stories mouths are trained to bury. X-rays don't care about loyalty. Scars don't care about marriage. Old fractures don't line up with accidents. As they examined me, I watched their expressions change. Professional concern turned into something sharper, recognition. They didn't confront him, not yet. That's the part most people don't understand. Real intervention doesn't announce itself. It moves quietly, like chess. A social worker named Tasha Williams came in under the pretense of routine questions. She asked about my home, my safety, my support system. She asked in a way that made it possible to answer honestly without speaking. Outside, Kofi grew irritated. He wanted to leave. He wanted control back. Inside, something rare was happening. A system that often fails women like me was for once paying attention. Evidence was being documented, calls were being made, a restraining order was already in motion. This wasn't just a medical emergency anymore, it was a turning of the tide. I didn't know it then, but that hospital room was the last place my husband would ever be able to lie about me again. They moved me to a different room sometime after midnight, not far, just far enough that my husband couldn't see me unless someone allowed it. They said it was because of imaging. That word sounded harmless, routine, but I noticed how carefully they rolled my bed, how the nurse stayed beside me like a shield, how the door closed with a soft but final click. That door closing felt louder than anything Kofi had ever said to me. Pain has a way of sharpening memory. As the medication dulled the edges of my body, my mind stayed wide awake. I watched every reflection in the glass, every shadow that crossed the hallway. I had spent years learning how to read danger in silence. Now silence felt different. It felt intentional. Dr. Amani came back with a tablet tucked against her chest. She didn't rush. She pulled up a chair and sat at eye level with me, not above, not looming. "Zola," she said quietly, "you don't have to answer this out loud if you don't want to. You can nod, you can blink, you can squeeze my hand." She paused, letting the options breathe. "Did someone do this to you?" For years, that question had lived inside me like a locked room. No one had ever asked it without already assuming the answer was no. When I nodded, just once, it felt like a small betrayal of the lie I had been protecting. But it also felt like oxygen. Nurse Eli stepped closer. He didn't look surprised. He looked focused, like a man who had seen this pattern before and knew exactly where it led if it wasn't interrupted. That's when I understood something terrifying and comforting at the same time. My story wasn't unique, and because it wasn't unique, they knew what to do. They documented everything, not just the injuries from that night, but the old ones too. Fractures that had healed crooked, scars with explanations that no longer mattered. Each note was precise, each photo clinical. No drama, just facts. Facts are dangerous to liars. Outside, Kofi started pacing. I could hear him through the wall, his voice rising, falling, trying different tones like keys on a ring. First concern, then annoyance, then authority. "I'm her husband," he said. "I need to see her." They told him she was resting, that more tests were needed, that hospital policy required patience. Policy is a beautiful word. It sounds neutral. It sounds like no one's fault. While he waited, the quiet rescue accelerated. Tasha Williams returned with paperwork and a calm smile that didn't ask permission. She explained my rights without overwhelming me. She explained options without pressure. Shelter, protective orders, legal steps. Each sentence was framed like a door, not a command. The assistant district attorney joined the picture next, not in the room but on the phone. I listened to half the conversation while staring at the ceiling tiles. They talked about probable cause, about evidence thresholds, about timing. Timing mattered because Kofi was still in the building. That knowledge made my heart race. Even sedated, fear cuts through. Part of me worried they were moving too fast. Another part feared they weren't moving fast enough. Years of emotional manipulation had trained me to believe that any step toward freedom would be punished. Kofi knocked again, harder this time. "I know she's awake," he said. "I saw her eyes earlier." That sentence crawled under my skin, the idea that he was watching me even when I pretended not to exist. Dr. Amani didn't flinch. She stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind her. I couldn't hear what he said, but I could hear what he didn't get to do. He didn't come in, he didn't raise his voice too much, he didn't win. Minutes later, Eli returned with water and a straw. His voice stayed low. "He's getting impatient," he said. "That's okay. Impatience makes people sloppy. Sloppy liars reveal themselves." As the night stretched on, I drifted in and out. In those half-dream moments, memories surfaced. Not just the worst ones, but the small betrayals that had paved the road. The jokes at my expense. The isolation disguised as protection. The way he'd rewrite arguments until I apologized for things I hadn't done. This wasn't just physical harm, it was psychological erosion. Broken trust doesn't shatter all at once. It flakes away until you don't recognize the ground you're standing on. Around 3 in the morning, a police officer arrived. Not lights and sirens, no spectacle, just a uniform and a clipboard. He spoke with the staff first, listened, asked questions, took notes. He didn't speak to me yet. That surprised me, but I understood why when Tasha explained it later. They wanted everything aligned: statements, medical reports, legal authority. They wanted the kind of case that doesn't fall apart in daylight. Kofi noticed the officer immediately. "What's this about?" he demanded. The officer said something neutral, something procedural. Kofi laughed it off. He always laughed when he thought he could charm his way out. He made jokes about misunderstandings, about how dramatic hospitals can be. But humor doesn't work on paperwork. When the officer asked him to wait outside, I felt my pulse in my ears. Outside meant distance. Distance meant loss of control. He argued. He said he was being disrespected. He said his wife needed him. No one contradicted him directly. They just didn't move. That's when his mask slipped. His voice sharpened. His posture changed. He stopped performing concern and started performing ownership. The staff didn't react emotionally. They reacted procedurally. More security appeared, quietly, efficiently. Inside my room, Dr. Amani held my gaze. "You did nothing wrong," she said, like she was undoing years of damage in 6 words. I wanted to cry. I wanted to sleep. I wanted to rewind my life to a version where trust didn't feel like a trap. Instead, I nodded again. That nod carried more weight than the first one. By dawn, the restraining order was approved. Temporary but immediate. That word mattered. Immediate meant now. Immediate meant not later. Immediate meant he couldn't follow me home. The officer came in then, gentle but direct. He explained what would happen next. He explained my choices. He asked if I felt safe speaking. I told him the truth. Not dramatically, not with embellishment, just facts, dates, patterns, injuries. The truth sounds different when it's finally allowed out. When they went to arrest Kofi, I wasn't there to see it. They made sure of that. But I heard the aftermath. Raised voices, then silence. That silence felt heavier than fear. It felt final. As the sun rose, painting the hospital room in soft gold, I realized something that terrified me even more than the violence ever had. My life was about to be mine again. Freedom is loud at first. It rattles everything you thought was stable. It forces you to confront the cost of staying and the uncertainty of leaving. Emotional revenge isn't always about payback. Sometimes it's about survival, about letting consequences exist where lies once lived comfortably. Kofi had spent years controlling the narrative. In one night, that narrative slipped out of his hands, and he had no idea how much more was coming. The moment they told me he was in custody, my first reaction wasn't relief, it was disbelief. My body had learned to live in constant anticipation of his next move. When that threat paused, even briefly, the absence felt unreal, like standing on a shoreline after a storm and waiting for the next wave to knock you down. They said his name like it was just another entry on a chart, calm, factual, contained. Kofi Mensah has been detained pending further investigation. Detained, pending, investigation. These were words I had never allowed myself to imagine attached to him. For years, he had been untouchable in my mind. Too charming, too composed, too careful. Men like that don't get caught. That belief is part of how they survive. Dr. Amani stayed with me when the officer left. She didn't rush out to the next patient. She sat there, hands folded, letting the weight of what had just happened settle into the room. "This is the most dangerous part," she said. "Not tonight, not the arrest. What comes after?" She was right. Control doesn't vanish when it's challenged. It mutates. By mid-morning, the hospital felt different. Not quieter, but sharper. Conversations lowered when they passed my room. Staff checked in more often. Security lingered longer. They were protecting me, but they were also bracing for backlash. Kofi had already started calling. First my phone, then the nurse's station, then the front desk. When those attempts failed, he switched tactics. He cried, he raged, he accused, he threatened lawsuits, he demanded explanations, he asked to speak to supervisors. Every call was logged, every word documented. The very things he used to control me were now becoming evidence. Tasha came back with a folder thick enough to be its own story. She explained the next steps slowly, carefully. Criminal charges, protective orders, emergency housing, counseling. Each option was a fork in the road I never thought I'd reach. I signed forms with a hand that shook less than I expected. The turning point didn't come with a scream or a dramatic confrontation. It came with paperwork, with signatures, with a quiet understanding between professionals who had done this before and knew exactly how fragile this moment was. Still, confrontation found its way in. Late that afternoon, as I was being prepared for discharge to a secure location, Kofi's lawyer arrived. That detail landed like ice water. Of course he had a lawyer. Of course he was already reframing the story. Men like him don't panic, they pivot. The hospital allowed the meeting only under strict conditions. I wasn't required to see him. I didn't want to, but his lawyer insisted on delivering a message, an apology. I almost laughed. The apology wasn't for me. It was for the record, carefully worded, no admission of guilt, plenty of concern for misunderstandings, a promise of counseling, a plea for reconciliation framed as compassion. They wanted me to sign something, a statement, a retraction, something to muddy the waters. This was the moment everything crystallized. For years, betrayal had been personal, private, hidden behind closed doors and polite smiles. Now it was procedural, legal, public, and for the first time I saw it clearly. This wasn't about love. It never had been. It was about ownership. I refused. That refusal changed everything. The lawyer's tone shifted. Soft concern hardened into thinly veiled warning. Court would be stressful, dragged out, painful. My past would be scrutinized, my credibility questioned. I told him I understood. What I didn't say was that my credibility had already been questioned for years, by the man who claimed to love me, by the voice in my own head he had trained. That meeting ended quickly. When the door closed, I felt something inside me lock into place. Not fear, not anger, resolve. The assistant district attorney visited me in person that evening. She explained the charges they were pursuing: assault, domestic violence, coercive control. Each charge was anchored to evidence: medical records, photographs, witness statements. Kofi wasn't just facing consequences, he was facing a narrative he couldn't rewrite. But the real turning point came when my mother arrived. I hadn't told her everything before. Distance and shame had done their work. She had believed the versions of my life I fed her because she trusted me, because she trusted him. When the verdict came back guilty on multiple counts, I felt something lift that I hadn't realized I was carrying. Not joy, release, the kind that leaves you exhausted and upright at the same time. Sentencing followed weeks later. He received time, conditions, mandatory programs, permanent protective orders. It wasn't everything some people wanted. It was enough to change the shape of my future. Afterward, outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, questions flew. I declined interviews. My story wasn't content, it was mine, healing the choir's privacy. Life didn't snap into happiness, it unfolded slowly. I learned how to choose furniture, how to sleep with lights off, how to laugh without checking the room. I changed my number, I changed my routines, I changed my understanding of love. Revenge didn't look like payback, it looked like peace. Months later, I returned to the hospital, not as a patient. I brought a letter. I thanked Dr. Imani, Nurse Eli, Tasha, and the staff whose names I never learned. I told them what their quiet competence had done, how it turned a lie into a record, how it gave me time. They accepted the thanks the way professionals do, modestly, but I saw the recognition in their eyes. They knew the ending mattered. I started speaking at a local support group, not as an expert, as a witness. Betrayal stories change when they're shared among people who know the cost of silence. Each meeting reminded me that truth builds community when lies isolate. One afternoon, while sorting mail, I found a note forwarded from the correctional facility, a final attempt, carefully worded, regret without accountability, longing without responsibility. I didn't read past the first paragraph. I handed it to my advocate. No response was required. Closure isn't something the betrayer gives you, it's something you claim. Today, my life is quieter, intentionally so. I work, I rest, I choose. Trust is slower now, but it's cleaner. I don't confuse intensity with intimacy. I don't confuse apologies with change. When I think back to that night in the hospital, I don't focus on the pain. I remember the door closing. I remember the question asked the right way. I remember the moment a lie lost its shelter. Betrayal thrives in darkness. Consequences need light. I didn't escape because I was stronger than him. I escaped because a system finally saw the truth, and I stopped protecting someone who never protected me. That is the ending he never planned for.